Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Scramble. I'm your host, Luis Rodriguez. Thank you for being with us. On today's show, we'll discuss the presidency and the relationship between the executive and the legislative branches. We'll also talk about the dispensaries of medical marijuana here in the Valley. Before we begin, let me introduce our panel. First, we have John Hudak, a Brookings scholar. Next, we have David Serabian, a UNLV graduate in political science. Next, we have James Schaefer, a junior majoring in journalism and media studies. And finally, we have Hunter Terry, a UNLV graduate in journalism and media studies. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot.
All right, before we begin, let me introduce our special guest, John. He is a deputy director at the Center of Effective Public Management and a senior fellow in government studies. His research focuses on the presidential powers, campaign elections, and legislative-executive interaction. His book, Presidential Pork, talks about presidential power in the granting of federal monies and is today's first topic. So John, could you please briefly explain your research and why is it that the Congress has decided to stop using earmarks?
Sure. So earmarks happen both in Congress and at the presidential level. And so my research tends to focus on presidential pork, as the book is titled. And it looks at the idea that presidents have vast sums of money that they dole out across the country. And I look at whether they dole that money out in political ways. And what the research shows is that swing states like Nevada can do quite well when a president is looking to get reelected, in the same way that we see Congress having a tradition of doing that. Of course, since 2011, Congress has stopped engaging in official earmarking and have chosen to go a different route.
And why is that? Do you know?
Well, there was this idea, though false, that earmarking was some form of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that the use of earmarks was being done in corrupt ways. In reality, they were being done to deliver benefits to constituents who needed them across the country, but it got caught up in a more politicized conversation in Congress that really departed from reality.
So do you guys agree that the stalemate between the executive and the legislative branches are due to not using these earmarks? We'll start with you, David.
I wouldn't characterize it as a stalemate. There are still, of course, ways that, even though earmarks are not allowed, you can still funnel money there whenever there's a base realignment and foreclosure, or we're going to expand a specific program in this specific congressman's district because there's a military base there, or we're going to allocate research funds to this specific private institution or this public university for this research. That is when you still kind of get this money funneling there. And especially when the president is directing specific projects or directing specific agencies to invest in specific projects, that's when it occurs. So I think what's really happened is on the whole, earmarks have gone down, but relatively they've really shifted more towards the presidency lately.
Okay. What about you, James? What do you think about this?
Well, with earmarks, I think the best example looking at exact implementation is looking at how the Department of Transportation uses it. The first example I draw on is the 2009 spending bill. We saw up to 8,500 or so earmarks on that bill alone, and most of those funds went directly to transportation and infrastructure issues. Looking maybe, for example, into the most latest issue up in Alaska, you have about $2 billion in unused bills used from earmarks going to important infrastructure in Alaska and roadways that are much needed. We're looking at corridors that have not been maintained, not been worked on in years, finally getting the attention it deserves, and all thanks to earmarks.
I would say I don't think there's anything wrong with earmarks in general. I think a lot of people, they think about we hear on the news of jets that are, costing us billions of dollars every year that aren't even usable in battle. But we keep those jets because it brings jobs to a certain senator state, and that helps them, as he mentioned, win re-election. You'll hear about pork barrel has been receiving a bad rep, those kind of actions for a long time. But by Congress, advocating those duties, much of the same money is still available. It's about 1% of the federal budget, and the president now has much more control, which, considering how obstinate this Congress has been regarding the president's powers in almost every other facet, it's surprising that they would trust him with earmarks.
Yeah, it's an important point. Congress thought that if they got rid of earmarks that would go away, but it didn't change the size of the pie. All it changed was who got to cut it up.
Right.
And now the president, who the Congress really despises, has much more spending power that they just gave up and handed over to him.
So do you think the Congress should implement back the use of earmarks?
I would think so. Especially from a conservative point of view, you want to keep that money on a local level because you think on a local level you have the best the best decision-making process for who deserves the money, where it can do the most good. I think whether it's on the congressional level or the executive level, there's going to be cases of it being used strategically, not just to help the state, but to help election prospects. And if you leave it to the executive, who only cares about the national electorate, swing states will see a lot of benefits. If it's divided more evenly amongst by Congress, then everyone has a stake in it and it should be distributed more evenly.
Go ahead, James.
It's all about striking a balance between country and constituency. You look at pork barrel spending, you look at pet projects by congressmen, you see areas in which spending has been on outlandish, silly projects such as that. You can pull up videos of shrimp running on treadmills underwater, these projects that congressmen use in order to show their constituency that they're working on issues that are benefiting them.
That's called science.
That is called science, but it is also called, well, what some might call stupidity.
Oh.
That's a scientific term, of course.
Of course.
So, John, other than using earmarks, is there another way that the two branches could work together?
Well, it's really difficult right now. The president has really had poor relations with Congress, and that's a problem that exists because the Congress doesn't really want to work with him, but it also exists because the president hasn't put in the time or effort to build rapport with legislators. It's not to say that having a better relationship with Congress will necessarily mean that the president is able to get more done, but it's easier to work with a president you like than a president you don't like. And the president has done very little to reach out to his colleagues in Congress. And in fact, if you talk to a lot of them, Democrats are angrier than Republicans with the president because they haven't even been had a relationship fostered with the White House. And that's a real challenge, and it shows a president just totally unprepared to deal with legislative politics.
Well, part of it we see with President Obama's style, and a lot of top policymakers and top defense officials even said that Obama's policy is not to get to personally know and build relationships with people at all, even close world leaders like Angela Merkel. And there was a piece, I forgot who wrote it in which article, in which piece it was about how blaming the specific election for Obama not being able to get along with Congress, and it was because President Obama had enough people in Congress that he could just push through Obamacare, that he didn't need to negotiate with Republicans. And so you had these first few years with President Obama where he doesn't have to negotiate with anybody and he doesn't have to build rapport with anybody, which is his style, and then he's just become entrenched in that.
See,
We can continue on, but I want to go to my next topic, and David just did a good job springing. So we can bring it back because, again, this is all in the presidency. So, like you said, we kind of, the Congress has made this picture of him as, King Obama. So President Obama has been accused of using his executive powers by passing many executive orders. John, is he really abusing this power, or is it just something that most presidents just do?
Well, the conversation around executive orders has been an interesting one, and one that's had only a marginal relationship to the truth. There have been two criticisms of President Obama. One is that he's issuing more executive orders than anyone else, any other president in history. That is fundamentally false. The second is that he's over... Who is? Franklin Roosevelt. Okay. And when you consider the pace of executive orders, that's not just in terms of number, but also in terms of days on the job. And but President Obama has issued fewer per day than any president since Grover Cleveland. So by historical standards, it's actually quite low. But the count of executive orders isn't necessarily talking about the impact of them. And so the other criticism is that he's using them in ways that are unprecedented or that are outside of the bounds of the law. And generally, when the court has ruled on this, with a couple of exceptions, they found the president to be within his bounds, within the bounds of the law. What people fail to recognize and appreciate is that presidential power is actually quite substantial when it's actively used. And this president has overstepped in a couple of cases, but not nearly as much as the political conversation has been.
So Hunter, I know I cut you off, so I'll go to you. Same question, and then you can continue on with what you were speaking.
Well, I think the two are kind of connected, actually. The executive orders, I think they ramped up a little bit later in his term, because when he started, despite what the conversation is, I mean, he wasn't. He was trying to bridge the gap. He ran on this idea of a team of rivals and bring Republicans into the fold. And when it came to his first his version of the stimulus package, which was our second, I guess, economists were calling for like 1.2 trillion, and to try and work with Republicans, to try and cross the aisle, he brought it down to 800 billion, knocking off a third, and then he even took 300 billion of that and turned it into tax cuts, trying to make peace across the aisle, trying to make it a bipartisan bill. And eventually that one kind kind of succeeded. It did get some support from Republicans. He did a very similar thing with the health care plan. Although we say he had both sides of the House and Senate, he forced it in, but really it took him almost 2 years because he tried so hard to make it something that could be bipartisan. He took out the public option, which was his alternative was to Hillary Clinton's universal health care in the 2008 primary. He added in a number of supports for and input from the pharmaceutical industry, trying to tie it to big business a bit, trying to work it within a way that conservatives would support it. And he had conservative support for much, well, not a lot, but a couple of people signed on for much of the 2 years who then kind of bailed at the end because they were not being accepted by their own party for that support. And so he was forced to then push it through.
But is it really bipartisan? Because when it came to the floor of the obviously we're talking on the floor of the Senate. When it came to the floor of the Senate, then Majority Leader Reid didn't allow even a time for the senators to review the 1,000-page.
Well, it's because it took almost 2 years for them to get there, and by that point he was about to lose his majority, his guaranteed majority in both sides. So they realized we played this game long enough.
But if you're saying a guaranteed majority, then you just really revealed that it wasn't that bipartisan, because if it was truly bipartisan, then he wouldn't have necessarily needed to worry as much in pushing that specific agenda.
You wouldn't think so, but anything he's done.
Well, I do think so.
This healthcare, you wouldn't think that it was bipartisan.
It wasn't bipartisan.
It actually was bipartisan. So it was
Wasn't
based on
bipartisan
Mitt
enough to
Romney and
pass on its
Republicans,
own.
but nothing has been. The Republicans, Congress has refused to pass almost everything Obama's brought. That doesn't mean nothing he's done is bipartisan. Just because it didn't have
But
bipartisan.
that assumes that he is bipartisan in every single effort that he's made.
No, it doesn't. Just because it didn't have bipartisan support on the floor doesn't mean the bill didn't include bipartisan ideas. The bill was built off of ideas Republicans put forth in opposition to Bill Clinton's plan in the 90s. Just because they didn't support it on the floor doesn't mean the idea itself didn't include bipartisan concepts, such as losing the public option, which was his main feature point in the election.
So, John, what do you think about this discussion that's been going on?
Well, I think one of the challenges that you brought up about President Obama is that he began his presidency with tremendous support, tremendous Democratic majorities, and he really didn't need to work across the aisle. Though you're right, some of the ideas that he entertained around ACA and other bills were coming from Republican sources, whether they were members of Congress or the Heritage Foundation or elsewhere. And that support wasn't there, but he didn't need that support. The problem, though, is if you're trying to look out at how effective of a president he's been or how successful he's been, there are a lot of metrics to go by. One of those metrics is the ability of a president to change in changing times. So the idea that he moved forward in his last 6 years, like he operated in his first 2, not looking to work with Republicans because he didn't need to, shows a president who falls down on the job. If all of a sudden you lose your majorities, you have to react in ways that are responsive and responsible to that change in congressional dynamics. He's really failed to do so. But what's more, and I can't stress this enough, he's also failed to build bridges with his own Democrats in Congress. There's no excuse for that. And I think when we see this dysfunction, when we see these barriers, we see these roadblocks, and actually see this really personal disdain that comes from the president, you have to appreciate the fact that there has been no effort from the White House, or very little effort from the White House, to build the types of connections that made Bill Clinton very successful, made Ronald Reagan very successful, made Richard Nixon very successful.
Yeah, and I do agree with you because, before, during his early years in the presidency, you would always see him and Harry Reid buddies with pictures, and now, you don't see that. So I guess that's very true to, our King Obama, as I'm quoting him. So, James, you've been very quiet, which is very strange.
Oh, okay.
So, do you not have an opinion on this?
Well, my opinion on this is just the cold, hard facts. Looking at Obama's legacy, we're looking at 13.7 million jobs being created in his administration. You're looking at a 69-month streak of economic growth. You're looking at those uninsured in the United States less than 10%. And you're also looking at landmark deals both with Iran, Paris with climate change, and also a trans-Pacific deal going along with Pacific Rim trading partners. He's done wonders in foreign policy. He's done wonders in domestic policy. And the only thing that we're lacking is attention at these issues. There's a lot that goes on behind the curtain of what we see behind the face of King Obama. And the less we pay attention to that, the more we demonize him. So I think we have to look a lot more at the report card of Obama and less of the crown, I guess you could say.
But was it really a success with some of his foreign policies? So, you just mentioned Iran. was it a success that in the bill it said that the United States would pay them billions of dollars?
Listen, Sammy Sosa was a great batter, but he missed some of his shots, okay? He missed some of his swings. Same goes for Obama. He, in this sense, is a great president in being able to implement what he considers policy that is important and prioritized by his administration. And looking at what has been implemented, sure, it hasn't all been successful. Of course, then it wouldn't have been implemented. But a lot of his goals that he has set out to do, you're looking at a report card that would look very favorably. You would get, Obama's teacher would say he is a pleasure to have in class, if you want to give it a very simplistic term.
Most students get pleasure in class. I mean, even he was a pleasure to have in class. I'm not saying that I was a bad kid or anything, but that's a generic thing if you're not a troublemaker.
It's better to have a generic president than a tyrant.
I think one way to look at this, too, is if a Republican president had the same record that President Obama does, would they brag about it? If what has happened over the past 7 years happened under a Republican presidency, would they go out and run away from their record? They absolutely wouldn't. They would absolutely embrace unprecedented job growth, perhaps not unprecedented economic growth, but sustained economic growth, drops in the uninsured rate, and a variety of other things that this president often brags about. And the challenge that comes out of that, of course, is that it makes it harder to elect a Republican after a Democrat has had such success like that.
And one additional thing is he's been able to pick up on what Republicans had left off on. Looking at No Child Left Behind, he was able to pick up on that, overhaul it, and create it into the Every Student Succeeds Act. Looking at the education system, he's been able to fix problems that the Republicans made for themselves in the past administration.
So let me get to my next question. President Obama has now announced his nominee to the Supreme Court. He has chose Judge Merrick Garland as his nominee. The Republican leadership has said that the president should not pick the nominee, and that is a decision that should be left to the incoming president. They have also pulled out an old video clip from Vice President Biden stating the same rhetoric. So who should have the obligation to fill this seat? So since you guys have been quiet, I'll start with you, Hunter. Who do you think should have it?
Well, I think that the president should certainly have nominated someone, and I think Congress should certainly give them a hearing. If Congress wants to filibuster it or vote him down, whether it's strategy or they really don't like his policies, that's their prerogative. But to not participate in the system at all seems childish and obstructionist.
What do you think, David?
Well, I agree basically along the exact same lines. The president's job is to nominate somebody. The Senate's job is to advise and consent. I'm against the idea of just not advising and consenting at all and just filibustering, but they're all going to do what they're going to do. But we know that by the next president, it'll be completely sorted out, whether it's Obama's nominee or the next president's nominee.
So on that, what will the next president need to do in he or she's first 100 days? So John, what do you think?
Well, obviously, one of the biggest parts of the first 100 days of any presidency is starting to get your staff together. And presidential transitions probably start a little later than they should. I've argued that they should already be happening. Every presidential candidate should have a transition team in place now, ready, thinking about these issues. In addition, the new president is almost certainly going to have to pick a Supreme Court nominee, but also start to carve out what is their true vision for America. On the campaign trail, we only hear bits and pieces of this. We only hear a little bit of very controlled, careful rhetoric about how they see America moving forward. The new president is going to have to tell us how much things are going to change and how much things are going to stay the same. And I think depending on who that new president is, there's going to be some substantial differences among them.
What about you, James?
The first thing you have to do is thank Obama for providing Garland as a sacrificial lamb for the next president. Whatever the next president needs to do is pick up on the old policies that Obama has already made. Pick up on protecting affordable care. Pick up on promoting a lot of our economic trade partners and making sure that our rapport with many other nations continue in the same way that they are. And try not to make too much, I guess you could say, waves in foreign policy that Obama has sustained. He's been able to take us out of the Middle East in some form. He's been able to decrease the amount of, that's a bad example. I would say that Obama has definitely been able to increase the amount of economic power we have across the world. There's a lot of different places where the next president will have to be able to pick up, and that's in economics, foreign policy, and domestic policy. And more specifically in domestic policy, maybe marijuana.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to have to make an executive order and take a quick break. So stick around and we'll be right back.
If you keep tanning, indoors or out, the effects of harmful rays will show up on your skin. Wrinkles, age spots, and an increased risk of melanoma, the second most common cancer in women 15 to 29. Stop tanning. Time may not be on your side. Learn how to protect your skin at spotskincancer.org. A message from the American Academy of Dermatology.
I remember the moment.
I'll never forget that moment.
That moment?
It was a moment that changed my life. I'd been training with my team for months, and now we had been called up for the first time. The real deal. Wildfires were getting dangerously close to homes. At that moment, I got my first taste of just how important the Guard is to my community.
See how the Guard can be an important part of your life at NationalGuard.com.
Thank you for sticking around. Our next topic is on an issue that is highly politicized everywhere, that is medical and recreational marijuana. The citizens of Clark County voted 10 years ago to have medical marijuana dispensaries throughout the valley, but it is only now that the commissioners have allowed a handful of dispensaries to open shop. Why is it that the people who really need the service are getting it now, and is the delay only happening here in Clark County? So John, we'll go with you, since that's another area that you research.
Sure. In a lot of states that have passed medical marijuana, they've really gone in two directions. One is the direction of delay, a really careful, some would say overly deliberative approach to getting this policy going. And others have really allowed a free-for-all. And so when you look at places like what Colorado did initially after passing medical, what California did after passing medical, there were a lot of marijuana dispensaries and not a lot of regulation. And that creates some challenges and some worry and some distrust in the public. In a place like Nevada, they've taken the other approach. Now, there's a drawback there. Patients aren't getting access to the cannabis that they want, but there's an effort toward regulation, which has positives to it.
What about you, Hunter? What do you think?
Well, I might say it's on two levels, because I think we voted to legalize in 2000, actually, to legalize medical marijuana. So that's 16 years it took to really get up and running. Now, 2 years ago, 2014, we did vote again and try and straighten out the legislation on it. They now have an implementation in process, to get licensing done, to have dispensaries be allowed to actually facilitate getting medical or medication to patients. But why it took so long, why it took the 10 years to get, or 14 years, that's impossible to really justify. The last 2 years, it's been very difficult because the licensing process was long and tedious, and it went through a couple different states of making cuts. And since then, we've implemented the most stringent testing requirements in the entire country as far as legal medical marijuana. And so when it comes to pesticides, heavy metals, mold, bacteria, all those kinds of things, the requirements are below even common vegetable standards. They're almost like dairy, other kind of farms that don't even have pesticides very often. And so a lot of companies, even though they've had their licenses now for about a year, have had a lot of trouble finding product that can pass, getting product to even grow in the Nevada climate without using pesticides, without using extra fertilizer, which can lead to the bacteria, things like that. So it's been a very tough road to hoe, even now that we've had the progress towards actually trying.
What about you, James? Do you think that the federal government should pass Mary Jane throughout the whole nation? Or?
Well, when you look at the federal level, I'd suggest looking at the local level. Look at Clark County. Look at the way that they've decided to take care and approach a lot of the issues with Sticky Icky, Wacky Tobacco, and the Mary Jane. Look at Euphoria Wellness. Clark County was very stringent and strict with a lot of the rules and clauses that didn't exist in the laws that we're talking about. They told Euphoria Wellness that they couldn't purchase certain amounts from customers, which they're completely reliant on, and asked them to keep quote-unquote promises. If the way that the federal government operates in the same way that Clark County is operated with the current dispensaries here in town, we're looking at very haphazard, ham-handled ways of handling weed.
Just to dance back on this real quick, that's one major problem is a lot of the dispensaries had arrangements to to buy from the patients and have kind of a collective type setup. But here, as he's mentioned, you can only buy a small amount from those patients. I believe it's about 2 ounces at a time.
2.5 ounces, yeah.
And they're required to have about 15 grams, which is a quarter of that total, tested for every batch, which means they're immediately losing 25% of their product before they even can see if they can sell it. The other issue is that looking on the local level is tough because it's still scheduled as a Class 1 drug. And until it's rescheduled, it's impossible to do much testing. It's impossible for the government to alleviate the laws or to make things accessible between interstate commerce. And as long as things are just local, but they don't feel safe with banking or with testing or security issues, there's nowhere to put their money and their product, it's going to be a tough road to get things organized and set across anything more than a very small area.
There's no better way to put it. When it comes to Clark County, the way that they scrutinize these dispensaries is very high.
Thank you, James.
Yeah.
Yes,
David,
James.
so
Yes.
you were working with the, you did your internship with the State Department.
Yeah.
So what do you think that the federal government should pass, whatever.
All right.
Sticky
So here's the perspective on that. One of the most insightful meetings was the Quarterly Executive Committee on Citizen Safety in the Western Hemisphere. And we had FBI, DEA, we had National Security Council, we had all of these agencies there. The FBI straight out said, and the DEA agreed, when it comes to illegal drugs, it's not something you can arrest your way out of.
So
There's no way that you can arrest your way out of it. Now the thing is, when it comes to the international level, because that's under the presidency, they're allowed to experiment with things that domestically wouldn't work. And legalization is something that works. DEA and FBI privately will tell you that internationally it works. But whether it will be applied domestically is a separate story, and it'll be a long battle.
All right. Well, with that, we're gonna have to shut down and go for the next episode. I just want to thank our panelists, and I also want to thank John for stopping by. Please follow us on Facebook at UNLV Scramble and on Twitter at UNLV The Scramble. Also, email us your opinions at unlvscramble@gmail.com. For further discussion, we want to hear from you. Answer our weekly question: should the Supreme Court nominee have a hearing? Let us know. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. So let's